Hello, this is Dr. Grant Cooper from Princeton Spine Joint Center. In the next 8 minutes or so, I'm going to tell you everything you need to know about arm and hand numbness and tingling. You ready? Here we go. First off, numbness and tingling are symptoms of nerve involvement or nerve irritation. So if you're having these symptoms, then somewhere in your body, the nerves are upset. Let's figure out where the problem is coming from by looking at the most common patterns by which the nerves become involved in the upper extremity. If the numbness and or tingling symptoms are in your wrist or palm and the first 3 fingers, and sometimes the inside, the thumb side of the 4th finger, then this is in the distribution of the median nerve. Right? The median nerve comes through the carpal tunnel over here and innervates these fingers on the palm side. If those are your only symptoms, it starts sounding like you might have carpal tunnel syndrome. Now, if the symptoms are worse in the morning and you wake up in the morning and you're shaking your hand out to make it feel better, if it's worse with computer use, then carpal tunnel syndrome is moving even farther and farther up the list of suspicion. On the other hand, if you have those same symptoms, but you're also having neck pain that's then radiating down into the arm and hand and into the first 3 fingers or the inside of the 4th finger, then it's starting to sound more likely that you have a pinched nerve in your neck. That would most likely be at the C6 nerve root level or the C7 or possibly the C5 spinal level. And this would be the most likely diagnosis until proven otherwise. If the symptoms get worse when you turn your head to the side of symptoms and then extend your neck, so if it was your right side, if you look to the right and then look backwards, and that reproduces the symptoms going down into the hand, then the diagnosis of a pinched nerve in your neck sounds even more likely. If the symptoms you're getting are in the 5th finger, the pinky, and or the pinky side of the 4th finger, on the palmar side, then this is in the distribution of the ulnar nerve. There are 2 common places that the ulnar nerve can become entrapped. One's in the wrist, over here, at what we would call Guillen's canal, as the ulnar nerve passes through here. And the other is in the elbow. The ulnar nerve wraps around the elbow, through what we would call the cubital tunnel. Cubital tunnel syndrome happens to be the 2nd most common peripheral nerve entrapment after carpal tunnel syndrome. It also happens to be the spot where when you bang your elbow and people say they hit their funny bone, what they're actually doing is they're hitting their ulnar nerve as it's exposed as it passes by the elbow. Now, if the symptoms are isolated to the hand and the 4th and 5th fingers, then the entrapment of the ulnar nerve in the elbow or wrist is most likely. If you compress the nerve at either of these 2 locations, Guillen's canal or cubital tunnel, and that reproduces the hand and finger symptoms, then it's most likely that the nerve is compressed at the spot where you were able to reproduce the symptoms. If there are neck symptoms and or radiating arm symptoms into the 4th and 5th fingers, then a pinched nerve in the neck is much more likely, and here would probably be at the C8 or the T1 spinal level. If the symptoms you are getting are in the back of the hand or fingers, what we call the dorsal surface on the back of the hand, then this indicates involvement of the radial nerve. Now, it's much less common to have a pure radial nerve entrapment, but it definitely can happen, and this would be called radial tunnel syndrome. Again, if you're also having neck pain and then pain or numbness and tingling that's then radiating down to the back of the hand and wrist and maybe the forearm, you still have to consider radial tunnel syndrome, but it's certainly sounding more and more like the neck is the source of the problem. Importantly, numbness and tingling isolated to the hand and finger on the palmar side is likely to be a peripheral nerve problem of the median or the ulnar nerve like we talked about, but you have to remember it still could be a pinched nerve in the neck. And similarly, though definitely less common, peripheral nerve problems such as carpal tunnel syndrome will usually only create symptoms in the wrist and hand and fingers, but they can cause symptoms that refer up into the forearm and upper arm and even into the neck, although that's much, much less common. So therefore, you have to keep all of these patterns in mind. Perhaps the most important overlooked phenomenon when we're talking about numbness and tingling in the upper extremity is called double crush syndrome. In this syndrome, there are 2 compressions of the same nerve chain. You can think of it as sort of like a river that's being partially blocked at 2 spots along the course of the river, and as a result, the water at the end of the river is going much slower. So for example, a common one might be the C7 nerve. The C7 nerve root becomes inflamed in the neck. Now the C7 nerve branches off several times and ultimately feeds the median nerve that then passes through the carpal tunnel and into the hand. In double crush syndrome, the C7 nerve can become inflamed, but the person can also have carpal tunnel syndrome where the nerve is also being compressed at the carpal tunnel. Now this is key to identify because failing to identify both problems often, can and often will lead to wrong or inadequate treatment. So for example, more than once, I've had this sort of scenario come up in the office where I've seen patients that have had surgery for example, carpal tunnel syndrome, and they find me because either the symptoms only partially improved or they failed to improve at all. There was one case that stands out in particular. It was a middle-aged guy. I saw him, he had carpal tunnel surgery for carpal tunnel symptoms, which really sounded like carpal tunnel symptoms, but the symptoms didn't get better at all after the surgery. Which is really uncommon. It's very unusual because carpal tunnel surgery for pure carpal tunnel syndrome is usually very successful. So the first thing I did when I saw him was I got a nerve test, and that nerve test showed a pretty significant inflamed nerve root at C7. And because we saw that, we then got an MRI of the cervical spine, and that revealed a really large disc herniation that was clearly irritating the C7 nerve root. Fortunately, what happened next is we did an epidural steroid injection, and the symptoms just completely went away. So in this case, he may or may not have ever had carpal tunnel syndrome before the surgery, but he definitely had that pinched nerve in his neck, and just no one had ever bothered to check for it. And the reason that he stands out so much to me, because I remember the look that he had when I saw him back after we had done the epidural, and the look in his face of just a mixture of disbelief and relief, and also frustration and anger, that the problem hadn't been properly diagnosed before the surgery. And it really drives home that when someone has nerve symptoms, particularly if surgery is being contemplated, you really have to consider the whole chain of the nerve. And getting electrodiagnostic study or an EMG first is really, would usually be a sound thing to do. An EMG allows you to trace out the whole nerve so you can see where the problem or problems are. So importantly, the person doing the test has to consider the presence of double crush syndrome. One of the things that we also see in the office is where someone has symptoms of carpal tunnel, they go to the doctor, they get an EMG, the EMG shows carpal tunnel syndrome, and then the EMG stops, and the person doing the EMG never looks at the neck or other parts of the chain of the nerve to see if the nerve is being compressed in a second place. And it just drives home another rule, which is if you don't consider a problem, you won't look for it. And if you don't look for it, you can't find it even when it's right in front of you. And that can lead to some really unfortunate outcomes. So it's important to be aware of and to consider. Okay, I hope you found this video on hand and arm numbness and tingling useful. And if you've enjoyed it and if you've learned something, then please remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell a friend who might also enjoy it, because that's the way that we can spread good health information and achieve good health outcomes together. And as always, if you have any questions that you'd like for me to answer in a future video, if you have any comments for me, you can reach me at Dr. Cooper at PrincetonSJC.com, or feel free to leave a question or comment in the comments section. Thank you very much.